So we need to talk about the decline of Christianity and how this is probably impacting the social fabric of this country. It has been amazing to watch, especially since I've been on my own journey because I was born and raised in the church in Oklahoma. But let's get into this Pew article before we get into all of it. This is from Pew Research, how U.S. religious composition has changed in recent decades. Only a few decades ago, a Christian identity was so common among Americans it could almost be taken for granted. As recently as the early 1990s, about 90% of US adults identified as Christian, but today about two-thirds of adults are Christian. The change in America's religious composition is largely the result of the number of adults switching out of the religion in which they were raised to becoming religiously unaffiliated. In other words, a steadily shrinking share of young adults who were raised Christian in childhood have retained their religious identity in adulthood over the past 30 years. At the same time, having no religious affiliation has become stickier. A declining percentage of people raised without religion have converted or taken a religion later in life. So this graph right here is talking about the rise of the religious nones, so no category at all, and the decline of Christianity. So you see down here the other religions, it looks like it's pretty much stayed steady, but the religious nones are the category that these Christians are falling out of and going to. I am one of those people. Switching gained significant momentum in the 1990s, according to the General Social Survey, GSS, a large nationally representative survey that has consistent data on religious affiliation going back several decades. In 1972, when the GSS first began asking Americans, what is your religious preference? 90% identified as Christian and 5% were religiously unaffiliated. In the next 2 decades, the share of nones crept up slowly, reaching 9% in 1993. Then the disaffiliated started speeding up. In 1996, the share of unaffiliated Americans jumped to 12%. 2 years later, it was 14%. This growth has continued, and 29% of Americans now tell the GSS they have no religion. Pew Research Center has been measuring religious identity since 2007 using a slightly different question wording. What is your present religion, if any, as well as a different set of response options? Since 2007, the percentage of adults who say they are atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular in the center's survey has grown from 16% to 29% during this time. The share of U.S. adults who identify as Christian has fallen from 78% to 63%. There are many theories on why disaffiliation has sped up so much in the 1990s and how long this trend might continue. For example, some scholars contend that secularization is the result of increasing existential security. As societal conditions improve and scientific advances allow people to live longer lives with fewer worries about meeting basic needs, they have less need for religion to cope with insecurities, or so the theory goes. Others say that in the US, an association of Christianity with conservative politics has driven many liberals away from the faith. Still, other theories involve declining trust in religious institutions, clergy scandals, rising rates of religious intermarriage, smaller families, and so on. When asked, Americans give a wide range of reasons for leaving religion, the Pew Research Center has found. So, this is a good opportunity to ask if you are a religious nun and you were raised in religion, what made you leave? I was born and raised I was a Baptist in Oklahoma, Black Baptist Church. Both parents were Christian. Granddaddy was a deacon in church. My grandmother played the piano in church. My mother was always volunteering in church. I think my daddy is still a deacon in church. So I was definitely in church. But when I was there, I didn't necessarily believe all that I was being fed, but I had to go. I had no choices. But like they were talking about, when people move away or migration, I have the opportunity to create some space and be able to make my own decisions. That's when I came out of the proverbial Christian closet, or I'm sorry, the agnostic closet, saying that I didn't really believe. But back in the day when you were living in your parents' house, you didn't really have a choice but to go. Okay, so we have two different graphs here. So Christian identity used to be stickier. Now unaffiliated identity is stickier. So this top graph is among US adults raised Christian, the percentage who are now. So for the ages 30 to 39, 66% are still Christian and 31% are religiously unaffiliated. But the older generation, the people who are over 40, if they were raised Christian, 80% are still Christian now. Now, for the bottom one, these are among US adults raised religiously unaffiliated. So 21% are Christian now, 73% are still religiously unaffiliated. So that's for ages 30 to 39. For the people who are um, over 40, if they were raised religiously unaffiliated, 56% are still religiously unaffiliated. Whatever the deeper causes, religious disaffiliation in the US is being fueled by switching patterns that started snowballing from generation to generation in the 1990s. The core population of nuns has an increasingly sticky identity as it rolls forward, and it is gaining a lot more people than it is shedding, in a dynamic that has a kind of demographic momentum. Christians have experienced the opposite pattern, with each generation, progressively fewer adults retain Christian identity that they were raised with, which in turn means fewer parents are raising their children in Christian households. And as women are opting out of being Christian, that is really impacting the households because typically culture goes through the woman. So this part was interesting. About 95% or more of people who were born prior to the 40s and were raised Christian were still Christian from ages 30 to 65. But those born in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there has been more substantial movement away from Christianity after the age of 30. For example, 91% of Americans born in the 60s were still Christian at the age of 30, but 83% identify as Christian today. Recent switching among older US adults may be a result of a period effect when something about the environment affects people of all ages for a period of time, like COVID 19, the consequences for the mental and physical health of all people of all ages. It might also be the result of a tipping point. Once Christians began to lose their overwhelming majority, people of all ages who had ties to Christianity but did not attend church, pray often, or see religion as an important part of their lives may have begun to identify as unaffiliated in larger numbers. As nuns grew in size and visibility, being unaffiliated may have become more socially acceptable in some circles, opening the floodgates to further disaffiliation. And I find that last part to be true because, like, when I say that I'm agnostic, it makes so many people raise their hand when in times past, like when I was growing up, being Christian and being Black seemed to go hand in hand. Like that was just literally part of our identity, was going to church on Sunday, having Sunday dinner and stuff after church, spending all day in church on Sundays and Bible study on Wednesdays. That was just literally part of our culture. But now, once it, like, other people saying, I'm agnostic, I'm atheist, I am not anything in particular, it has made people more comfortable with raising their hands and saying, girl, me too. The New York Times put out an article back in June saying young women are fleeing organized religion. This was predictable. And I'm going to make that into a part two because we definitely need to talk about women leaving religion. And it is totally predictable because women have been used throughout the forever for labor in churches, volunteering in churches, tithing in churches, but men have always been in leadership, using their roles as a way to oppress women. And yes, there has been oppression and keeping women down, preaching submission and all of that. So we need to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about that in a part two. So this article from the New York Times came out back in June from Eleanor Davis, and it kind of flew under my radar. Young women are fleeing organized religion. This was predictable. We definitely need to talk about that. As we have been talking about politics, we see men are becoming more conservative, women are becoming more liberal, and all of this seems like is going hand in hand. The fall of Christianity, the fall of patriarchy, women are on an upward trajectory, and it seems like men are failing and flailing as more and more women opt out of marriage, opt out of children. It just seems like all of this was destined to happen. Like she said, this was predictable. All right, let's get into the article. Alexis Drought, 28, was raised Christian in Kentucky. Her parents took her and her sister to non-denominational megachurches that adhered to a lot of Baptist and Pentecostal ideals, she said. As a kid, she loved the way every service felt like a concert, filled with music and light, and she made loads of friends through church. She went to Berry College in rural Georgia, a place that she described as steeped in Southern culture, where religion is incredibly important. But even surrounded by believers as a college student, Drought began to question some of the values she was brought up with. Specifically, she took issue with the sexism, with the purity culture, with being boxed in as a woman. She couldn't stomach the notion that you only have these specific roles of childbearing, taking care of children, cooking, and being submissive to your husband, she told me. That was also around the time that Donald Trump was elected to president. Drought added, so I didn't want to associate with that kind of evangelicalism. Drought is representative of an emerging trend, young women leaving the church in unprecedented numbers, as Daniel Cox and Kelsey Ayer Hammond wrote in April for Cox's newsletter, American Storylines. Cox and Hammond, who both work at the Survey Center on American Life at the right-leaning American Enterprise Institute, explain, for as long as we've conducted polls on religion, men have consistently demonstrated lower levels of religious engagement, but something has changed. A new survey reveals that the pattern has now reversed. While over the past half century, Americans of all ages, genders, and backgrounds have moved away from organized religions, as I wrote in a series on religious nuns, atheists, agnostics, and nothing in particulars, young women are now disaffiliating from organized religion in greater percentages than young men, and women pushing back on the beliefs and practices of several different faiths, particularly different Christian traditions, is something I have been reading about more and more. Cox and Hammond write, what's remarkable is how much larger the generational differences are among women and men. Gen Z men are only 11 points more religiously unaffiliated than baby boomer men, but the gap among women is almost 2.5 times as large. 39% of Gen Z women are unaffiliated compared to only 14% of baby boomer women. The proportion of unaffiliated millennial women is pretty close to that of Gen Z women, 34%. The big shift seems to have taken place between Gen X and millennials, as only 23% of Gen X women describe themselves as nuns, according to Cox and Hammond's analysis. They argue that increasingly there's a cultural mismatch between young women who are more likely to call themselves feminists and to support the LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights, and the teachings of some of the largest Christian denominations in America, which are veering right and turning more towards retrogressive ideas about women's places in their organizations. The Southern Baptist Church and the country's largest Protestant denomination may be the most glaring example of this tension, as my newsroom colleagues Elizabeth Dias and Ruth Graham reported last year. An ultra-conservative wing of the church's leadership flexed its muscles and voted to bar women from its leadership ranks, ousting several churches that retained female pastors. The final vote on the issue is taking place this week at the denomination's annual convention. And I did talk about the Southern Baptist Convention and how they have literally told women, you have no place in leadership. And obviously, as more and more women are getting their education, are going into the workforce, they are pushing back on that notion that being born with a uterus automatically means that you're supposed to be submissive and subservient. So obviously, this is bound to happen these days because more and more women are flexing those muscles and the feminism is pouring out because the sexism has always been there. The crackdown on women, Diaz and Graham reported, is on its face about biblical interpretation, but it also stems from growing anxieties many evangelicals have about what they see as swiftly changing norms around gender and sexuality in America. Melody Maxwell, an associate professor of Christian history at Acadia Divinity College in Nova Scotia, told me that it's not really a surprise that the Southern Baptist conservative wing rallied in opposition to women as pastors. Since the 1970s, she said, the SBC has been enforcing more conservative gender roles for women. This is one of the reasons why you see in the public sphere and politics that more men are becoming conservative, and more women are becoming liberal. All of this divergence makes sense. It all goes hand in hand. This direction included the idea of complementarianism, the notion that men and women have different roles in life that are defined and affirmed by God. This view is understood in a variety of ways, and there's a good deal of disagreement on how it is interpreted. Regardless of how it's interpreted, women are saying, get someone else to do it. And what is going to happen? What we're seeing happen, we're seeing more and more women join join the ranks of the educated. And obviously, since more women are enrolling in college, that means that more and more women are actually graduating, because not everybody that enrolls actually graduates. We see more women stick and stay in the workforce, whereas we have already talked about the 7.2 million men that have dropped out of the workforce. All of this is working with the societal shift that is coming. And these men are becoming more and more flustered, and they're failing and flailing as more and more women are pushing through, becoming homeowners, getting their money up. The child free movement has also increased because they're not worried about these different roles that are prescribed by God, because women can pick and choose if they decide to have babies, if they decide to get married. And since women are getting married later, in the 1950s, we were getting married in our early 20s. Today, most more women are getting married closer to 30. So we already have an education established, work history established, and all of this works hand in hand. So none of this is surprising. And we're going to see, I believe that this election is really going to highlight things and how things are going to break. Are you going to be voting for this man who is a known sexist and racist, or are you going to be like, okay, this woman does have the qualification? I believe that all of this is coming together and coming to a head at the wildest time, as we're seeing all of these changes and these shifts happening. All right, y'all, join the conversation. We definitely will be talking about this more and more. Let me know what you think. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.